Welcome to European Journeys. This is the 10th and last stage of a tour that takes us to Latvia and Estonia, where we explore the Livonian Reformation, that is, the Reformation that happened there in the beginning of the 16th century. Now, for this stage, we are returning for the last time to Tallinn, and we are going to explore another site which is an important testimony, an important witness to the Reformation that happened in the ancient Livonia. Now, Tallinn, as we've seen in previous stages, it is the third time that we're coming back here. We've seen that this is an ancient city. It's a medieval city. It was called Reval by the Germans. And we can see that also with a big part of the medieval walls that are still standing today. And also some gates are still well preserved today, such as a gate that is on the northern side of the city, which is called Suur Rannavärav in Estonian, and in English that means simply the Great Embankment Gate. Now, if we go through that gate today, there's just a street passing through, there's no gate anymore, it's just a tunnel. That street that goes through that gate, in fact, is one of the main arteries of the city. It is called Pikk in Estonian, and if you walk 500 meters along that street, it's a cobblestone street, beautiful. 500 meters further down the road, we find on the left-hand side of the road a house which was built in the 19th century in the Tudor style and which is named Pyhä Kanuti Gildi. That is again in Estonian, and it means the Guild of Saint Canute. Now, Guild and Saint Canute, these are two terms which point back to the rich heritage of the city. One heritage is the commercial heritage of the city. We've talked about that already. It was an important hub, an important commercial hub in the past. And there were many guilds living that were in the city. Guilds, these were societies for merchants. There were several of them in the city. Tallinn was in fact a Hansa town, that is a town part of the Hansa League, which was a league of towns for trade along the Baltic, along the North Sea as well. And so Tallinn was an important commercial hub. The second name, Saint Canute, points back to an ancient king of Denmark. Now that sounds surprising maybe for those who are not accustomed to the history of this land, but Denmark has ruled over the northern part of Estonia, over Tallinn, between the 13th and the 14th century. So this is also a good testimony of that period of history for Tallinn. But we're not talking about Canute today. We're not going to talk also about the guilds. But the reason why we want to see that house is because on the facade we find two statues above the entry of the house. The statue on the left is the King of Denmark, Saint Canute, and the statue on the right represents none other than the father of the Reformation, who is obviously Martin Luther himself. Now again, those who don't know the history of the Reformation in the Baltics and are not accustomed to the fact that the Reformation came to the Baltic lands might be surprised to find a statue of Martin Luther here in Estonia. In fact, Martin Luther never came to Estonia, never came to Livonia in the 16th century. He lived in Saxony, and the distance between Tallinn and Saxony is over 1,000 kilometers. So why do we find Martin Luther here? Well, obviously, if you follow the past episodes, you will remember that Martin Luther was in communication with a lot of people in the Baltic lands. We've talked about the secretary of the city council of Riga, Johann Lochmüller, who began to write to Martin Luther in the early 1520s, so in the very beginning of the Reformation already. Interactions between Martin Luther and some people in the Baltic lands was happening. Another man who interacted with Martin Luther was Melchior Hoffman. We've talked about him in our previous stages when we visited the city of Tartu. And Melchior Hoffman, we've seen that because of the uprisings that had happened in the city, the uprisings, in fact, had caused him to not be seen with a good eye by the city council of Tartu. They were also doubting his theological soundness. And so Melchior Hoffmann also went directly to Wittenberg, to Saxony, to ask for the support of Martin Luther. So Martin Luther was in connection, had interactions with people who were in the Baltic lands. And that pushed him to write, in fact, a letter to the leaders of the Reformation in Livonia. And that letter was dated to the 17th of June, 1525. And that letter was entitled Exhortation to the Christians in Livonia Concerning Public Worship and Unity. Why was he writing such a letter? Well, as we've seen in our previous stages, in particular the last one, there was division happening. Division was beginning to grow among the Reformation camp, among the evangelicals in the land. And that was a cause of great concern, of great worry for Martin Luther. So Martin Luther thought that it would be good to write a letter to the leaders of the Reformation there. And his concern was about public worship and about unity. So let's look a little bit at what he wrote. Well, firstly, he began by thanking God for the fact that God had allowed the people in the Baltic lands to discover the treasure of the Word of God, the treasures of the Bible which lead to salvation, the key to salvation that is found in the Word of God. That was the heart, one of the main messages of the Reformation. Martin Luther began by being thankful to God about that. But then he goes quickly to the reason of his letter and the concerns that he had for the church in Livonia. And this is what he writes. I have heard through credible witnesses, most probably Melchior Hoffmann and others, how faction and disunion have arisen among you also in this way, that some of your preachers do not teach or act concordantly, but according to whatever each one thinks is the best, according to his own judgment and will. So the movement was growing a bit wild. Everyone was doing according to what he thought best, and there was no harmony really between the people. At least that's what Martin Luther writes in his letter. And so he continues and he says, hardly anyone knows what he should espouse or with whom he should side. So there were factions that were gathered around several leaders. And we've seen that, for example, in Tartu with Melchior Hoffmann on one side and Tegetmeier in the other. Well, so the heart of the matter was whom should we follow, or rather there should be harmony between those who have adopted the Reformation. And his point of concern was in fact liturgy. There should be common liturgy between the churches. Now that sounds to our modern ear rather foreign. Isn't it true that what is most important is to worship God with our heart, not so much with the form? So why should Martin Luther talk about liturgy? Well, in fact, Martin Luther would agree with us that the most important really is to worship God with our heart. Liturgy is not that important. You would say that liturgy is a non-essential. But nevertheless, and we will see that through what he writes, he will bring a case for the necessity of having a common liturgy. And so this is what he writes. If one ordains and establishes nothing, then one is likely to act rashly and make as many factions as there are heads, a situation which fights against Christian simplicity and unity, about which St. Paul and St. Peter teach so frequently. So Luther understood that a common liturgy was necessary for the well-being of the church and also for the unity of the nation itself, of the land itself. And here is the core of the message. Here is really the core of what he wanted to say. This is what he says. For as has been said, even if the external uses and regulations are free and taking the faith into consideration, may with good conscience be changed at all places, at all hours, by all persons, still, taking love into consideration, so because of love, you are not free to use such liberty, but are in duty bound to consider how matters may be made bearable and better for the common people. So, you see what Martin Luther is saying. There should be order in the church, not so much to please God. We can worship God freely, but for the sake of love, for those who are outside, who see us, we should have unity of liturgy. We should have a common liturgy so that we promote stability. There would be stability within the church, and that would also generate stability in the land. That was the heart of the message of Martin Luther to the reformers in the Baltic lands. Now, the history after the Reformation of the Baltic lands, people in the Baltic nations know very well how much turmoil there was. We've talked about the Great Northern War between Russia and Sweden. We've talked about the Polish-Swedish War, but there's been so many other turmoil that have happened, not the least, obviously, the Soviet takeover, the Soviet occupation, 50 years of occupation after the Second World War. So even up until recently, really, the Baltic lands have known a lot of turmoil. If Martin Luther had not written, had not called the attention of the church in the Baltic lands towards the unity, which meant also unity of liturgy, well, maybe the history would have gone in a different direction. The church has learned to be united also through the common liturgy. That's why the Lutheran Church, if you visit a Lutheran church today in the Baltic lands, you will find a liturgy that is quite common across the churches, and that goes back to Luther's concerns, in fact. These concerns, as I said, were not just for the stability of the church, but that would also promote stability within the lands of Livonia at the time. And as I said, had he not pointed the attention to that, maybe the history would have gone in a different direction. So this ends our tour of Livonia, in which we were exploring the Reformation there. There would be much more to say, as I said, but we will finish here and start a new series next time. I'm Cedric Placentino. See you next week for another stage of European Journeys.